Laura and Pete sat in the departure lounge of Flight 3425 to Bali, holding hands. After all the preparations and arrangements, it was nice to finally get through the formalities. Laura closed her eyes. She needed this vacation. It had been a long year. Yes, 2 weeks of sunshine, just what the doctor ordered. Pete let go of her hand to pull his phone out of his pocket when he heard the message alert. That reminds me, Laura, don't forget to put your phone in airplane mode. I didn't bring my phone with me. Pete was distracted looking at the phone screen. Laura was admiring his face when she saw it tense up. What's the matter, Pete? Pete nervously held out the phone and she read, Peter Ware, raise your hand to this woman and you'll regret it for the rest of your life. God, Pete, what a fool you are. You should have warned your wife, she knows. Laura joined Pete, looking around at all the visible faces in the living room. Impossible, Laura. I packed everything last night when she was in bed and put the suitcases right in the car. She's been as kind to me as she's ever been. It can't be her. Then it must be the wrong number, Pete. No, it mentions my name. Could it be your husband? Don't be silly. He has no idea about anything either. He thinks I'm away on a 2-week course. Besides, how would he know your name and number? We've been incredibly careful. Absolutely no one knows about us. Whose number is it? I don't recognize anyone. I have some cool friends and I don't think they'd want to prank me. Tell you what, I'll call Penny and you call your husband. See if anything seems out of the ordinary to them. Laura watched Pete press the speed dial number. There was no answer and he left a message saying he missed her already. Pete hung up and looked at Laura perplexed. Are you going to call your husband? I didn't bring my cell phone with me. You can use mine. Laura started to reach for the proffered phone, and then they both realized how stupid it was. For the first time, Laura began to regret the decision she had made. Further conversation was interrupted by a call about boarding the plane. They stood in line together, but they were no longer comfortable holding hands in public. Laura noticed Pete scanning the passengers looking for familiar faces. Laura was vaguely amused by this. He continued his search as they walked to their seats. They took their assigned seats, and once seated, Laura entwined her arm with his arm and rested her head on his shoulder. Why didn't you bring your cell phone with you, Laura? It's all part of my cunning plan. You'll be proud of me for it. I'll show you once we're in the air. Half an hour later, the plane gained altitude, and Laura pulled her laptop out of her bag. She started it up and navigated to a Word document. I've invested in our future, lover. When my husband goes to bed tonight, he will find a letter from me. If he doesn't agree with what it says, we've lost nothing. And if he does, this trip will be the beginning of a new life for both of us. Here's a copy. She handed the computer to Pete. My dear husband, I love you and only you, and have loved you since we met 25 years ago. I hope to spend the next 25 years or more with you. This is what I have always wanted and what I have sincerely wished for until now. I love you more and more every day, and have happily dedicated my life to taking care of you and our wonderful children. With the exception of some visits to friends, I have asked for almost nothing for myself. I know you love me and would always want me to be happy and content. Since we love each other, I want to propose to you. I have purposely approached it in such a way that you have 2 whole weeks to think about my idea. If we were to do it face to face, there would be a great danger that you would become macho to me and say something that we couldn't live up to. I can't take that risk. It's the same reason I left my cell phone there, so you can't contact me for the entire 2 weeks. I'm not on a work course and no one there knows where I am, so don't waste your time trying to contact me. Darling, you are a wonderful lover and I never tire of being in your arms. However, I miss having sex with other people so much that I risk incurring your wrath by doing what I do. Before you get angry, just keep things in context. I'm going away for 2 weeks with a friend from work. I have never been unfaithful to you, and without your full blessing, I never will be. My proposal is as follows. With your blessing, I would like to do this with other men. I feel that my needs have grown so much that one man, even one as talented as you, will not be able to fulfill them. It will never be someone you know, and I promise to always be discreet. In fact, I will be so discreet that you won't even know when or where unless you want me to. At the slightest hint that anyone we know suspects what I am up to, I will stop immediately. You will always have me whenever you want me, and nothing about that will change. You are my husband, and your needs will always come first. I want you to be assured that this will not change the way I feel about you or our lovemaking together. In short, it will not affect us in any way. Think about that for the next 2 weeks, please, darling. If you love me as much as you say you do, you'll jump at this opportunity to prove it. I know how much you love me, and that knowledge will be with me every time I fall asleep at night while I'm gone. That's why I trust you to pamper me now. Please, dear, think about this for the next 2 weeks. If you answer no, I will honor your wish and appreciate the opportunity to talk some more. I will try not to be too offended by the names you call me and your implied lack of trust. If you answer yes, then all you have to say is the answer is yes, and we need not talk more about it, though I would be glad if you would like to. Your loving wife, Laura. Pete finished reading and only said, "Wow. Yes, it's good, isn't it?" I have to admit that I borrowed many of the words from a story I saw on an erotic fiction website from a guy named Big Eye 33 who wrote, "We need to talk." Why did you call writing an investment in our future? Don't you get it? I asked my husband's permission. If he says yes, then when we go back, we can move on with our lives without guilt. Laura mentally added, "Well, I can go on. 2 weeks with you and I'll be sure I don't need you anymore. But your replacement? That's a whole other story." You're so sure he'll agree to that? Of course. I've given the impression he has a choice, but that's only so he can convince himself he's in control. If he dares say no, then we'll have to keep sneaking around like we used to. Well, how do you like it? Not bad. Decisive and logical. However, it's a decision he'll never base on logic. I hope he's not a real man, otherwise it's a bit insulting. What? There's no way he could be offended by anything in that letter. It took me several days to write it exactly. Yes, but you have to realize that you could spend a whole year and still risk offending him. As a woman, you can never understand how a man's brain works. The main thing I learned from this letter is that he is no longer able to satisfy you, and that, no matter how good he is, he never will. You should know, Laura, that every man is a little paranoid about his work. The thought that he might leave you for someone else who might be bigger or better only fuels that paranoia. Honestly, Laura, I can only see two reactions to him reading this. The first is to give up and put his hands down. The second is to come out swinging. Well, I think you're wrong. I know my husband. He will appreciate my honesty and give it serious thought. If I ask before I do something, it will be completely risk-free. Pete looked at his future lover and thought how much she believed in her own foolishness. He was already seeing her in a new light. Sure, he'd told untruths to get a pass from his wife, but Laura's outright lies and her manipulation of her husband alarmed him. Part genuine curiosity and part devilishness drove him to his next question. How did the big guy story turn out for Laura? Did the lady drink? He got the answer long before she opened her mouth. Her face suddenly became very serious. No, her husband kicked her out. To distract her from doubting whether she was doing the right thing, Peter changed the topic of conversation. After all the effort and expense of this trip, the last thing he wanted was for her conscience to awaken and actually do what the letter said. An innocent vacation. Sid, I didn't tell you about that weirdo I saw at the international registration, did I? He was standing about 25 feet away from me while I was in line. When he saw me looking at him, he just stared at me and ran his index finger down my throat in a slashing motion. I looked around to see if he was doing it to someone behind me, but there was no one. It was creepy. Laura asked, "Yeah, what did he look like? The world is full of weird, disturbing people." That's the thing, Laura, he looked like a regular guy. Over 6 feet, dark hair, goatee. Peter stopped as Laura sat up abruptly and fumbled for her laptop again. She turned it on and navigated to some files. A picture appeared on the screen, showing herself and a man standing in front of a house. In a voice trembling with excitement, she asked, "Is that him?" It could be him, Laura. It looks a lot like him, but I can't be sure." Laura looked at Peter with interest. Did he have an incentive to lie to her? Was he afraid that if she became convinced that her husband had figured out their games, then... For the first time, it occurred to Laura that Peter was a man willing to cheat on his wife and therefore untrustworthy. What was he wearing, Pete? That's another woman's question, Laura. Guys don't notice what other guys are wearing. Didn't you say he dropped you off at the domestic terminal? Yes, I did. I convinced him to just drop me off and walk away. When I saw him leaving, I took the bus to the international terminal. So he must have gone back to his car, driven to the international terminal, parked, and then knew who to run after in the check-in line. Pretty unlikely, Laura. I think it's more likely that it was just a random psycho. He knew he had to distract Laura, who looked far from convinced. Is that your house in the picture, Laura? Laura, who also wanted a distraction and was used to people complimenting her on her house, went on autopilot. Yes, that's the one. It's beautiful, isn't it? We bought the beach house as an investment. It's very steep and narrow. You wouldn't believe the house is collapsible, would you? My husband spent 15 years on it, but he kept adding to it, fixing it up and renovating and fixing around it. You have to see it from the inside out. He is an artist, and each room has murals with a theme. A nautical theme in the bathroom and living room. A business theme in the office. You walk into the office and the atmosphere says, work, and you work. I'm not going to tell you what the theme is in the bedroom. We've won all kinds of awards for interior design and for the way the house utilizes the land. There's even a creek running under the house. The conversation turned to the topic of their families, which they have so far skirted in their relationship. They talked about Pete's 2 children, ages 6 and 8. Laura talked about her 3. Sarah, a 23-year-old who had just graduated from law school and was working as a real estate lawyer, and her 2 stay-at-home kids, 16-year-old Daniel and 13-year-old Larry. Laura didn't know it, but she tried desperately to distract herself. For a while, she succeeded. Then she pulled out a notebook and wrote, lawyer, home, and children. Not knowing if her husband was following her, she couldn't make any plans for him. However, she knew she had to back herself up by protecting the house and family. After the couple fell silent, Laura began to berate herself for being a coward and not thinking about her situation or the possible situation. She pieced together the chronology of events. She had packed on Thursday evening, being careful not to include anything non-business or unreasonable to wear on the weekend between her 2 weekly courses. That evening, her husband behaved perfectly normally. On Friday, she went to work at her usual time. They wanted to do some serious work on her company car, so she arranged for her husband to pick her up on Friday afternoon. He went into the reception area, waited for her to pack her things, and drove her home. They had lunch with the kids, took them to their grandparents' house, and then worked on the car until late into the night. Saturday morning, an early rise, a trip to the airport. Laura remembered how nervous she was when she suggested her husband just take her bags to the check-in line and leave them. Other times he stayed until the plane took off. She was relieved when he immediately agreed. She'd watched him all the way to the parking lot and then waited for him to back the car out. Now his impatience to leave took on a darker meaning. She compared his behavior last night and tonight to her careful planning. Heck, no one from her job knew anything except that she'd taken annual leave, and her husband didn't know anyone from her job at all. There was no way he could know what she was planning. The text message that came to Pete's phone was a prank call from a friend, a guy staring at him in the check-in area. A random nut job. Relax, Laura. What would the consequences be if he found out? She'd lied to him about her destination, so what? The letter said she was traveling with a friend from work, but didn't specify if it was male or female. She didn't realize she'd closed her eyes until they opened. She imagined her husband finding out her final destination at the airport and realized how it would look to him. The deception would have to look like she had slipped away precisely to hide. That in itself was already serious, but with some skill one could defend oneself. Combined with the contents of the letter, however, it was not in the slightest doubt. Laura spent the rest of the flight trying to hide as much as possible. The first task was to destroy the letter lying under her pillow 2,500 kilometers from her ass. The second task was to convince herself that she was worrying about nothing. Laura, always ready to foresee every possible scenario, wrote a long letter to Sarah, knowing she couldn't send it before Bali. In it, she begged her daughter to go to her house and do 2 things. The first was to pick up her phone and switch it to Pete's number. She reasoned that she was embarrassed to tell anyone that she had forgotten it, and she had bought a prepaid phone for the trip. The second task was to retrieve the letter from under her father's pillow. She begged not to read it as it was deeply personal, written between husband and wife. Mother and daughter were very close, so she knew she could trust her not only to follow all instructions but also to behave tactfully. Laura also asked Sarah to acknowledge receipt of the letter and to notify her again that she had done what she had been asked to do. As soon as Pete and Laura got off the plane at Denpasar Airport, Laura sent the letter and then, figuring her husband wouldn't check the caller ID, called him from Pete's phone. None of her calls were answered then, or during the hour it took to get through customs and to their hotel. This had never happened before, and alarm bells rang in her head. Just before the cab pulled up to the hotel, Sarah called Pete's phone and confirmed that she had done as requested. Laura managed to dodge a few questions about what was going on. When Sarah asked if her father was all right, her answer horrified her mother. Her father had called to say that he had some things to think about, and that he was taking the other children to his cabin in the country. Sarah was going to join them in the evening. Laura asked her husband what he was going to do this weekend, and the answer, of course, did not include the cabin. Worse, the cabin was isolated from all 21st century communications. Laura was so puzzled that she let her daughter make the call without further question. Chapter 2. Laura's husband has just cooked a barbecue dinner for his 3 children at the cottage. They are begging him to take them camping with him to get wallabies for their favorite campfire stew tomorrow. Sarah senses her father has been distracted since her arrival, but doesn't press him. They sit down at the table for a family reunion. Sarah starts the conversation. Is it about Mom, Dad? Yeah, she's been acting weird for a couple months now. Some kind of emotionally withdrawn. And yesterday and this morning I learned some funny things. The sense of dread that gripped the room was only compounded by Dad's sigh as he finished that statement. They knew him as a strong but jovial man who was rarely serious. They waited. Your mom told me she's leaving for a 2-week course, long distance for work. All 3 children confirmed that she had told them that. Yesterday afternoon, she asked me to pick her up from work, so I did. Standing in the waiting room, I saw through the glass of one of the offices that she was talking to a man in his office. Something about the way they were standing there looking at each other didn't seem right. She didn't come out for over 5 minutes, so I peeked into the reception area. On the wall hung pictures of all the top people in the company. I recognized the guy she was talking to. His name is Peter Ware. I picked up his business card at the front desk. There was no way I was going to sleep in the morning, so I went downstairs. I'm a little embarrassed to admit it, but I looked in your mother's purse. In it, I found her passport, and upon looking through it, I discovered a visa stamp for Indonesia, dated 3 weeks ago. I remembered seeing her reading a brochure about Bali last month. Their father paused and looked around the room, clearly contemplating what to say. Bali is in Indonesia and is not interstate, it's overseas. I didn't say anything to your mother, but accusing someone of cheating without proof, especially someone you love unconditionally, is over the top, Sarah interjected. We know, Dad. We were raised on your and Mom's values, remember? Never cheat, never lie, always treat everyone with respect until they lose that respect, and then just quietly walk away. Yes, that's why what happened this morning is so hard to understand, let alone talk about. The somber atmosphere in the room intensified. They gave Daddy as much time as he needed to gather his thoughts and decide what to say and how to say it. This morning, your mom asked me to just drop her off at the domestic terminal and leave. She said she was nervous about leaving you home alone for too long. Completely willingly, I agreed and went straight to the international terminal. I waited there, next to check-in for flights to Bali, and saw Mr. Peter Ware going through check-in. I hid and kept watching. 15 minutes later, your mom showed up and checked in as well. I was too stunned to meet her gaze. Do you think? Yes, Sarah. I think your mom lied to us, really, and went to Bali to have an affair with a man she works with. The father turned away, but it was obvious to all 3 of his children that he was suffering greatly. They had never seen the great man cry and were willing to pay almost anything to avoid seeing his obvious pain. One by one, starting with Danielle, they enclosed their father in an embrace. Sarah took the lead again. What are you going to do, Daddy? I just don't know, kids. But I do know that if she ever sleeps with another man, we're finished. Fidelity is the cornerstone of marriage, and any breach of it is unforgivable. If she hasn't and isn't sleeping with him, I still don't know if I can get over her cheating. So all I've done at this point is send them both a message that if they touch each other, there will be trouble. That way I can put off making a decision until I have a chance to make a decision. Makes sense? Sarah nodded to everyone and then told him what he didn't know. Mom left her phone at home, Dad. She wouldn't have gotten your message. I know how to get in touch with her. Do you want me to tell her to leave that creep alone? No, Sarah. I want her to respond for her own reasons. A decision made because of fear of the consequences is not a decision. She has to have the right motivation. What number did she give you to contact her? Sarah pulled out her phone and opened the long letter from Laura. She read out the first 6 digits to her father, and he read out the last 4 to her from a business card he pulled from his pocket. By this simple act, all 4 people in the room were convinced of the absolute veracity of his story. A silence ensued. That's not all, Dad. Mom asked me to get a letter for you from under the pillow at home. She reached into her bag, pulled out the letter, and held it out to him. Everyone waited for him to read it. He objected to reading it aloud, knowing what it said. Young Larry broke the impasse. Daddy, this letter is about our family. We have always made all the important decisions as a family. You have to tell us about it. Dave looked at his youngest son and realized he had never felt so proud. Here he was, with his siblings, at the center of the greatest crisis their family had ever faced, and he had handled it better than his own father. They had all handled him. They hugged again, and then Dave started reading. He reread it 3 times, the second 2 times, emphasizing the 3rd paragraph. Without the 3rd paragraph, it was a perfectly legitimate request from a wife to her husband and, if taken at face value, a perfectly mature proposal. However, one sentence in the 3rd paragraph distorted the entire message. I'm going away for 2 weeks with a friend from work. I have never been unfaithful to you, and without your full blessing, I never will be. One proven lie made the rest of the message suspect or just plain wrong. After an hour of mature discussion, the motives of the mother and wife proved surprisingly close to the truth. When other solutions were discarded, the obvious conclusion was reached and a course of action was determined. Depending on the answer to one question, the mother probably no longer deserved to be a member of their family. Dave tried his best to stand up for the absent party. Listen, kids, if a crime was committed, it was against me as your mom's husband. You mustn't let it affect your attitude toward her. Once again, it was a little Larry who answered for everyone. No, Papa. The moment she lied to all of us, she chose herself. Dave looked intently at his son. When he saw the bulging chin and serious eyes, he realized that the acorn hadn't fallen that far from the tree. Chapter 3. Laura stunned Pete at the hotel front desk by asking for a private room on another floor. She booked it for 2 days with the possibility of an extension and asked for the right of first refusal if the room was completely full. Pete checked into the hotel and looked questioningly at Laura. He was told to think about it, go to his room, unpack and meet her in the lobby in 2 hours. He embarrassingly complied. They met at the appointed time. Peter didn't hesitate and, seeing what Laura was wearing, decided he wouldn't mind basking in her arms. They had been close for a month now, but other than kissing and groping, nothing had happened. What's going on, Laura? Think about it, Peter. We arranged to come here together. You get a message on your phone addressed to you by name, telling you that if you lay a finger on this woman, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. This message came shortly after a man who looked like my husband made a threatening gesture in your direction. Are you with me? We were driving here, and my daughter informed me that my husband has been acting very different than usual. For the last 3 hours, my husband hasn't returned my calls, which again is not his style. Pete was no fool. He understood what all this could mean, but he didn't see or care what it had to do with him. Said, I think there's an 80% chance my husband knows we're here together. Don't ask me how he knows that. I have no idea. I'm 100% sure that if he finds out we slept together, my marriage is over. That's a price I don't want to pay. If I was 100% sure he knew, I'd be on a plane home by now. If I knew and he didn't, how the hell would I be able to explain coming back so soon without telling an outright lie? We've been together for 25 years. He'd recognize a lie in a second if he was alert. I'm sorry, Peter, but we're not sleeping together until I call my husband and convince myself that he doesn't know anything. Peter looked visibly disappointed by this statement. Laura realized he was about to object and interrupted him. Peter, if you were my husband and you suspected that I had left and was seeing another man, what would you do? Easy. I would hire a private investigator and get proof. Laura watched logic break through the filters of lust in his head. She was still annoyed that the seriousness of her situation didn't penetrate his thick skull. You haven't tried calling your wife since you got here? That got his attention. Peter immediately started looking around all the dark corners of the hallway, trying to make out the camera. Great, now you get the point. Tonight and tomorrow, I will sleep alone in my room. When my husband gets back from cleaning and can call me, we'll work it out. In the meantime, don't come to my room. Don't come near me unless it's a public place and don't touch me. If my husband calls, do not answer or put the phone on voicemail. Find me as fast as you can. These are the numbers he'll be calling from. Now, give me a friendly kiss on the cheek and we'll each go our separate ways. Peter did as commanded and both retired to their rooms, looking around for surveillance. If either of them had bothered to look at the phone number that Pete's threat had come from, they would have realized that Laura was 80% already under surveillance. She just didn't know it yet. Chapter 4. 4 days had passed and the long-awaited trip had gone far from according to plan. Food was eaten in the hotel restaurant and any physical contact was avoided. Laura, protesting, dragged Peter around the many stores looking for outfits, and on Tuesday, they even went on a day trip together. If they were being watched, it was by professionals. Laura insisted they spend all their days together in case Dave called. On Monday, Laura bought a discarded cell phone and had Pete practice switching to it in case of a call. Her stress level only increased slightly. The school vacation was approaching, and it was quite possible that Dave had taken Danielle and Larry to the cottage for more than one weekend. However, the fact that Sarah wasn't answering emails was seriously worrying. Peter held out until Tuesday evening. He retired early. On Wednesday, Laura was so agitated that she sat in her room all day making inquiries on the internet, researching information about divorces. Then she emailed her in-home attorney and asked him to confirm her assumptions about the outcome of a hypothetical divorce. With his help, she handled all personal legal matters for the family. She handled all such matters for the family. He responded that, although it was not his expertise, he believed her assumptions were correct. 3 times a day, Dave and Sarah made phone calls and went unanswered. The 80% level began to approach 90%. Cut off emotionally from everyone she knew, she felt as alone as she had ever felt in her life. She sent Sarah an email, begging her to contact her. Dave didn't use email. After not receiving a response until Friday, Laura decided to secure her future. She asked her attorney, who had all the necessary authorizations to lock up the family finances. She transferred ownership of the only remaining vacant piece of land to a trust, with Sarah and herself as trustees. The trust could be accessed by any of the signatories. She transferred the bulk of the family finances into 2 separate trusts in the names of their minor children. The trustees were again 2, but this time both signatures were required. The child in question and one other. Of course, she wanted the second one to be herself, but the lawyer had convinced her to make him the child's legal guardian. It would be more secure that way, he assured her. Of course, the child's signature was useless until he turned 18. Making sure her wallet was under control in case the worst happened, and if it all turned out to be a storm in a teacup, she could undo the changes. Laura slept better than she had all week. On Saturday, within an hour of each other, 2 bombshells arrived. The first was brought by Pete, who came to her room against her instructions. Concerned that his wife was unresponsive, he contacted his brother and asked him to come to his house. The brother reported that he did so. Pete's wife asked him where his brother wanted the divorce papers delivered. She called him at work and found out that he was not away on a business trip but was on annual leave. That explained how Dave knew about it. Peter immediately flew home to try and deal with the aftermath. Laura immediately contacted her lawyer and had him sign off on all the changes, escorted Pete to the airport and moved into the vacated room. The second bomb was closer to home and much more devastating. She started checking the 2 younger children's Facebook accounts. Nothing had appeared there since she'd left. No hints of what they had been up to, and no responses to request to contact her or otherwise confirm her existence. This time, a new message appeared on Larry's account. It informed anyone who wanted to know that his mother and father were getting a divorce. "No!" screamed Laura in an empty room away from her family. What the hell was David doing? Divorce was followed by talking, arguing, and explaining. Yes, even sometimes it was followed by goodbyes. And the kids. So, she was the main breadwinner in the family and worked hard. It was inevitable when Dave dropped out of high school and left her for college. Of course, that meant Dave was the main influence in their kids' lives, but this shit had gone too far. She prayed, praying to any god who could hear her, that he would read the right signs and stop her and Pete's plans before they came to fruition. If that didn't happen, Dave would soon have the private investigator's irrefutable conclusion that nothing had happened, and now that Peter was gone, nothing would happen. As she cooled down, she began to think rationally. When no one was talking to her, she used her considerable intellect to try to see dispassionately what Dave had seen. She made some educated guesses. Someone had found out about her trip to Bali. That someone couldn't be Dave. The only evidence of the plan was on their home computer, and Dave was computer illiterate. This someone, probably Peter's wife, had told Dave, probably as early as the morning of the flight. All he could know was that she had lied about the destination and was traveling with Peter. Unless? The letter. If Sarah had ignored her instruction not to read the letter? If Sarah shared its contents with her father? Laura quickly pulled out the letter and read it with her eyes open. It took 3 attempts, each accompanied by a rapid heartbeat. Point 1. Simple statement of facts, no problem. Point 2. Preparation to start twisting the truth, but otherwise facts. Point 3. Part truth, part complete lie, and now he could recognize it. He was a wonderful lover, but she was tired of his embrace. It was obvious to her, and if he had seen the letter, it was obvious to him as well. A private investigator's report would show that the presence of a friend here was inappropriate, and the presence of a male friend her husband knew nothing about was inappropriate. In the cold light of rationality, she realized that if he had sent her this letter with an outright lie, everything else would immediately come under suspicion. Consequently, her assurances of fidelity would prove futile. If she went back to the beginning, her words about him being a wonderful lover would also fall under suspicion. Suddenly, she realized what his main problem was. Peter was right. She had called into question Dave's entire belief that he was satisfying her. His ego would be badly wounded. But she hadn't betrayed him. The private investigator's report should confirm that, at least as far as this trip was concerned. Naturally, he could assume that she had begun adultery before this trip, but Laura already had a plan ready to counter such an opinion. When had the private detective started the surveillance? If the moment they had just checked into this hotel, they should have known by now that the private room idea was happening. Thought Laura. Too many unknowns. The 4th paragraph, which had seemed so thoughtful and loving when she'd written it, was now, if he assumed it was all a lie, just empty garbage. So was the whole letter, if he considered it in hindsight. It had turned out to be a complete lie. Laura really hoped he hadn't seen it. Conclusion. If he hadn't seen the letter, she had a job to do. If he had, she suspected no amount of subterfuge would help. The irony of the situation almost brought a smile to her face. Her only savior at the moment was the private investigator's report proving that nothing had happened in Bali. Laura hoped the private investigator was good, but took comfort in the fact that he was so good that she hadn't noticed him, hadn't even realized his presence. Laura metaphorically kicked herself. Why had she done that? It took a whole night of thinking under the influence of alcohol. Laura concluded that she was the classic wife who has everything, but sees a future that is different from the past and resents it. A successful wife and high-flying businesswoman who has spent her entire career lying, hiding every possible option, and yes, cheating. A woman approaching menopause who had an itch that needed scratching. And so, relying on her wit and her husband's naivete, she scratched it without consequence. The new irony did not make her smile. Laura realized that she could soon be a successful businesswoman and divorced woman who still hadn't scratched that damned itch. The next morning, since there was no indication that she would get answers to her questions here, Laura decided to head home as soon as possible. First, she decided to use her negotiation skills to delay her protagonist's irreversible steps. She wrote a letter to David through Sarah. Laura wrote the letter vaguely because she didn't know if Sarah had shown the letter to her father or if she had even read it. Her plan was to try to get out of the divorce situation, but to count on the fact that if the worst happened, she would be on the winning side. Since she was the kind of person who could anticipate things, she found counselors in her town and made an appointment with the one she chose online. Then she dressed for the day tour she had booked 4 days ago. She would still have time to call the airline. Chapter 5. Sarah walks into her father's house and overhears the end of a conversation between her father and his neighbor. So besides telling this Peter's wife about your suspicions, what else did you do, Dave? Nothing. Hey, Sarah. You know John Smith from next door, don't you? He's a lawyer, too. He's kindly agreed to give me some advice. Oh, stop it, Dave. After all the landscaping advice and help you've given me over the years, not to mention all the tools you've lent me, it's the least I can do. Hi, Sarah. Hi, John. Are you here to help Daddy with his divorce? Well. Who's talking about divorce? All we know for sure is that your mom lied to us and is spending 2 weeks in Bali with someone. I, for one, will wait to see what she says before I decide to divorce her. Please forgive my absent-minded father, John. He can be very naive at times. Yesterday, Mom's lawyer called me in to sign a trust agreement that effectively removes Dad's control over some family assets. We then checked all the bank and investment accounts and found that most of them had disappeared somewhere. She's doing everything she can to take you out, Dad. Admit it. And this finally reveals her true colors. Sarah held out 2 pages of a printed letter to her father. He read it, then handed it to John. Dear Sarah, please print out the enclosed letter and give it to your father. Again, I rely on your discretion not to read it. It concerns personal matters between him and me. Dear David, I suppose you have already realized that I lied to you about the purpose and location of my trip this week. When I return, we will talk about it, and I hope you will listen to my apology for the huge mistake I made with the same patience you have always shown. Just know 2 things, and please don't do anything until we talk. 1. I love you and only you, always have and always will. 2. Since we became exclusive, I've been faithful to you all these years. Not once have I ever had anything with anyone but you. I concede that my actions lately have given you ample reason to doubt that, and I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to convince you of that basic fact. I suggest you take a lie detector test when I return, hopefully in the next day or so. I am willing to stop and take it on the way home from the airport if you can arrange it. You will provide questions and ask whatever you want. After this elephant has been removed from the room, I can apologize for any disrespect you feel I have shown you. Please don't do anything rash. We both know where divorce will lead. You will lose the house you put your heart into and half the money we plan to spend on your early retirement. Think about the kids. Divorce always splits families, and if you ask around, the mother always gets custody. Having Sarah and Danielle on my side is a given. It would be a tragedy if the divorce drove a wedge between them and Larry. I know you love the kids, and we both realize that not being able to see them whenever you want would destroy you. So please, don't do anything until you've given me a chance to explain. See you soon. Your loving wife, Laura. John finished reading the letter. Wow, if it weren't for what we know she's been doing behind the scenes, this would be really compelling, emotional material. What do you mean, John? Well, Dave, you have to realize that in my work I see all sorts of gimmicks. This one is pretty common. Your wife decides she wants out of the marriage. She looks for a replacement, finds one, and decides to try it out on a 2-week vacation. I believe this is called an affair away. Usually, if she decides he's the one, she comes back, quietly takes all assets out of your control, and then files for divorce. The really smart people poison the relationship between innocent parents and their children first, like Laura started doing with Sarah. Writing a letter portraying you as a wimp that Sarah was allowed to find is one of the most sophisticated things I've ever seen. The best way to win in a divorce is to deal your partner a complete blow, limit their access to good advice, that is, leave you penniless, and then make the kids choose who to go with. In this case, the choice would be between the comfort of a mother in the family home and a homeless father living in a slum. Surely there must be another explanation. I can prove it. Contact 3 of the best divorce attorneys in town. The one or ones who refuse to take your case are already representing her. I bet she gave all 3 of them in advance to keep you from taking the case. If you go broke and get a better lawyer, this bluff has a better chance of working. What bluff? This whole letter is a bluff, Dave. Her lawyer must have already told her that a mother getting custody of children as old as yours isn't what it used to be, especially since you have a good chance of being considered the primary caregiver. Dave, the purpose of this letter is simple. She wants you to stop doing anything while she finalizes preparations for the ambush. Her problem is that you found out about her plan before it was fully worked out. When her plan is finalized, she will want the divorce finalized as soon as possible. certainly before Larry turns 14 and can decide which house to live in. You can expect her to insist that you seek counseling. In this country, the courts will only grant a divorce if you have lived apart for 12 months, or if a psychologist has said the marriage is not repairable. Expect her to pick a counselor and intimidate you. Threats at the end are common for women instigating divorce. Dave withdrew, asking John who the best divorce attorney in the area was. Dave called, gave his name, and asked for an appointment. He was told they couldn't take his case. Dave didn't know that the best divorce attorney in town had a lot of cases, and he told his secretary not to take any new ones yet. Dave went back to the break room. Okay, John, I believe you. What am I supposed to do now? First, you will authorize me to block all finances that Laura doesn't already have. Then you will restrict her ability to spend any other shared finances. How do I do that? Well, start by canceling all credit cards and joint names. Okay, but I'm still a little uneasy. After all, she's so sure she still loves me. But that doesn't really fit with the threats in the second half of the letter. Dad, are you sure Mom lied to you? Yes, Sarah. Do you lie to the people you love, Daddy? No, I don't. What did you always tell us about the 3 pillars of a successful partnership, Dad? Love, trust, and respect, didn't you? How many of those do you have left? Well, 1, now that you mention it. And how many of them is Mom showing you right now? None. Ta-da! Chapter 6. When Laura went to pay the fine for changing her flight date, both of her credit cards were declined. She rushed to the ATM she'd used before. There, too, they were declined. She went into emergency planning mode. Hotel and meals had been paid for in advance, so she wouldn't starve to death or be thrown out on the street. She had a few hundred in traveler's checks just in case, but it wasn't enough. Since there were no friends at home to borrow money from, the only ones left were her parents. Asking them to wire her money would lead to questions she didn't want to answer at the moment. She quickly sent an email to her lawyer, asking what was going on with the bank accounts, and then plunged into a boring, mindless week before her planned departure. She was perplexed as to how her simple, fail-safe plan to fix the itch could have brought Dave to ruin so quickly. She knew he would never forgive her for being unfaithful and had knowingly taken the risk, realizing the chances of being caught were astronomical. What could have motivated him to take such drastic action? He suspected that she was having an affair with another man and already knew that he had left and nothing had happened. He had no way of knowing about her financial maneuverings. He didn't even know who their financial attorney was. He had always trusted her to take care of such things. While she was quietly banging her head against the desk in her room, 2 emails arrived that didn't make her feel any better. The first was from Pete's wife, Riley, thanking her for ruining her marriage and jeopardizing her children's secure future. It might have hurt her badly if the second hadn't come while she was processing the first. At first, it seemed to be one of her own letters to Peter from 2 weeks ago, looking forward to her trip. His and her addresses were listed in the address line, so the letter was forwarded to herself. Attached to the letter was a simple question. Why did you lie to us, Mom? The letter was signed Danielle. Her husband may have been computer illiterate, but her children were not. She realized for the first time that Dave was not the only victim of her deception, nor was he the only participant in her punishment. She also realized that the letter didn't answer that simple question. It also showed Sarah's unresponsiveness in a different light. Laura cried with loss and disappointment. She then sent a letter to Danielle that basically said she would explain the misunderstanding when she got home. Her daughter must have expected this because the reply followed immediately. It's strange that you chose to spend our school vacation with another man, rather than with Daddy and us. Laura cried again. It had been an extremely stressful and boring week. With a limited budget, there was nothing left for her to do but lie on the beach. She grabbed a towel. After an hour, she left the beach and returned to the hotel. She realized that coming home with a great tan was tantamount to proving once again to everyone that they were lying. Gripped by frustration, she sent a long letter home via Sarah. Without going into detail, it spoke of errors in judgment on her part, of being taken for granted as a wife, mother, and primary breadwinner. It even talked about her sense of self-worth in a "that's my excuse" style. The letter mentioned twice that she had not slept with anyone other than Dave during the marriage. The letter again urged her not to do anything rash until she had a chance to talk. There was nothing like an apology in the letter. It was not the style of a strong businesswoman who knew she was in an advantageous position. She hit the send button and got comfortable enough to wait. Chapter 7. Okay, kids, it's time to have a serious discussion about what we're going to do when your mom gets home. I'm a little surprised that she decided to stay there, and unless we find out anything different, we'll have to assume she'll be back on Friday as planned. How are we going to play it? Remember, all we know is that she planned to leave with a guy from her job. We don't know anything about whether this is the first time she's lied to us. You first, Sarah. Well, all I had to do was read her last letter, Dad. It shows that she's just a smug bitch who treats us like a minor inconvenience that can be sidestepped. The fact that she cheated on us the first time is, in my opinion, irrelevant. She had a choice. Take her annual vacation and spend it with her family, or use it to disappear with someone else. She already spends little time with Danielle and Larry given her long work hours and business trips. I think her behavior before and after she was found out is just disrespectful to all of us and dishonest. If she doesn't change her behavior, I'm done with her. Good, Sarah. Harsh but fair. What about you, Danielle? I think she just doesn't get it, Daddy. I agree, dear. When we hear from Larry, I'll explain what I'm thinking of doing. Larry? I don't care, Daddy. Just as long as I stay with you. I'll do everything in my power to make that happen, son. Tell us about your idea, Daddy. Well, I think for some reason your mother went off the rails for a while. I don't know. But the promotion last year seems to have caused a change. Kids, I hope you'll back me up. I think if she admits what she did and is truly remorseful, we should give her another chance. What do you say? Sarah looked at her younger siblings and felt agreement. Little kids just needed stability until they reached that reactionary age where they discarded everything their parents believed in and tried to change the world. That's right, Daddy. We'll try. But you saw her last letter. I've reread it 16 times and I see no remorse. Oddly enough, I believed her when she wrote that she had never been unfaithful to you. I agree, Sarah. That's why I've planned a little shock for her. When she experiences it, she will realize that we believe she has already committed a crime against the family. I don't think she'll realize how offended we are, so she'll focus on the physical impact. After we let her know our feelings, the million-dollar question is what she will do about it. If she breaks down and apologizes to all of us, we'll talk about it. If she doesn't, we'll see. That's my idea. Chapter 8. The return letter took Laura by surprise. It was from Sarah, but addressed to Dave and all three children. It described the timetable for her return. After reading it, a sense of foreboding gripped her, as if she had failed in her task. She was due back late Friday night. The letter stated that she had an appointment with a polygraph examiner and indicated that questions would be asked of all four rebels. After the test, she would be put up in a motel for 2 nights so she could mull over her answer. Anytime after noon on Saturday, she could request a meeting to discuss the family's future. Laura resented being ordered around, but decided to play along with their little game for now. One thing was certain. As soon as she ate her humble pie, she was in for a serious beating. People need to know who's boss in the house. Relieved, she relaxed a little. She was glad her offer of a lie detector had been accepted. It was the surest way to convince Dave that she had kept her vow. She knew that if she could convince Dave, everything else would fall into place. What questions would he ask? He knew about her behavior in Bali, that was a given. The main question he would ask would be, had she done anything with Pete before Bali? If he asked the direct question, did you have sex with Peter or anyone else other than your husband? She would be at home. She feared he might ask more insidious questions, such as, have you always behaved in a manner befitting a wife? And then she would be on shakier ground. She had nothing in common with Peter in the strict, Bill Clinton-like sense of the word. Before Pete, there was Michael. They hadn't had sex either, but only because Mike had chickened out at the last minute. Laura realized it was a mistake to be too anticipatory with the questions. She knew that polygraphs relied on indicators such as heart rate and sweating. By taking the questions at face value, she risked raising her stress level and causing a false positive reaction. However, she practiced answering her simple-minded husband's implied questions anyway. Generally relaxed, she left for the airport at the appointed time. She deliberately didn't tell anyone what time her flight was arriving. Under the pretext that everyone would be busy with work or school, she insisted on a cab. There was no way her family would be in the domestic terminal when she arrived at the international terminal, right? As she exited customs, she couldn't help but compare the way she'd arrived to how she'd envisioned it. Instead of purring like a contented kitten, she arrived with a begging bowl in her hands. After the cab ride, she sat in the polygraph waiting room for an hour until one of the technicians ushered her into the room. He outlined the basic procedure of preliminary questions to calibrate the equipment to her specific physiology. Then the technician pulled out a folder and frowned. "Ah, yes, that's the one." Laura blushed slightly. Knowing the nature of the questions, she realized that the operator would soon guess her recent history. "Mrs. Brown, my questions have a rather unusual format. Instead of the usual list of questions, they are presented in the form of a flowchart." "Huh?" "Yes, I've seen that a couple times before. There's a first question and then, depending on the answer to that question, a choice of what to ask next. It slows things down a bit, but it doesn't affect the validity of the tests, I assure you. Are you ready to work?" "Ready as always." The operator moved on to the 8 calibration questions, then paused to open the file again and read. Question 9. 2 weeks ago, you went to Bali with the intention of doing so with Mr. Peter Ower? Yes. The operator looked at the polygraph reading and made a notation. Then he looked at the file. Laura was not surprised by the question. She braced herself for the next one. Would it be a question about whether she had actually done it with Pete in Bali, or a question about whether she had done it with Pete before going to Bali? She hoped like hell that the question would be asked in a form that she could plausibly deny. To the simple question, "Did you have sex with Peter Ower?" she could answer no and walk on by. Please keep it simple. The technician closed the file and began taking the paper out of the machine. "Thank you, Mrs. Brown. I have an email address to send the report to. You're free to go." To say Laura was stunned is a vast understatement. What the hell does that mean? What, just one question? Yes, an unusual one. I've only seen it once before, and I know that guy was trying to say something. I think whoever wrote those questions was too. Your husband. Laura nodded machinally. What was he trying to say, because I don't understand? I assume your husband wants to say that he doesn't care at all if you had an affair in Bali. He just wanted to confirm that you were going to do it. He's saying loud and clear that your intention to have sex with this guy from Peter is enough for him. Good luck, Mrs. Brown. There are business cards for a couple of good divorce lawyers on the receptionist's desk. Laura left the room in a daze. Her entire defense, her entire education had been built on convincing her husband that she hadn't slept with anyone else. Lacking professional merit, she had no idea how offended he was by her dishonesty and simple intent. Frustrated and angry, Laura made one last mistake. Ignoring the possibility of going somewhere else to give herself time to make a rational decision, she jumped into a cab and drove home. In her opinion, it was now a true battle of wills. The competitive instinct kicked in. Dave had fired the first shell, and now it was her turn to return fire. And as the cab dropped her off at the entrance to her neighborhood. From the car on the opposite side of the street, Dave, Daniel, and Larry looked sadly at each other as they watched the enraged woman head toward the former family home. They were grateful to have done all the necessary things last night. The last thing Dave wanted was to be bullied in front of the kids. It would definitely be bad for their health. They reached the room they had booked for Laura and made sure their phones were turned off. Chapter 9. There was no word from Laura until Monday. The hope that she had used this time to think rationally was faint, but present nonetheless. That last hope faded when, late Monday night, Dave received an email from Sarah. It censured him for his low tactics in sicking the kids on her. It spoke of an emergency hearing in family court being arranged by her attorney to decide temporary custody of Danielle and Larry. Playing on John's predictions, the letter also informed her that she had set up an appointment for them to meet with a psychologist the next day. A family meeting was to be held on Wednesday evening. Laura had pondered over the weekend and, as usual, had devised a plan that she felt covered all the possible options. The first was to try to save the marriage, which Dave seemed to have written off. This required seeing a counselor. A female one, of course, to maximize the chances of her explaining her train of thought to her husband. Second, family sessions to explain her actions to the children. Third, of course, a trial to make sure that if the worst happened, she would be on the winning side. Laura was already in the psychologist's office when Dave showed up on Tuesday, just in time. He was immediately attracted to a woman in her 40s, dressed like a 60-year-old. Chairs were arranged facing the counselor, but more than an arm's length apart. After introductions, during which Laura was Laura and Dave was Mr. Brown, the aging hippie invited Laura to speak first. Laura told the story of their marriage and then laid out the facts as she saw them. She was a faithful wife and mother until for some reason she went off the rails, lied to her family, and had a date with another man. There was no sex, as the husband who watched her attested, but the intentions were there. As she left, she was stunned to learn that her credit cards had been canceled. She was sorry for what she had done, and her most sincere wish was to simply put the episode behind her and continue living her life in marriage to David. The counselor looked at Dave. All right. First, I would like to say that I am speaking on behalf of myself and our children. My children's main complaint is that their mother lied to them, used 2 weeks of her annual vacation, which lasts 6 months, to go off on her own, and left her phone number so that she could not be contacted in case of an emergency. To be honest, I didn't assign Laura any surveillance in Bali. This stunned Laura. Since it was the first thing she had to do, she couldn't believe it was true. In fact, I didn't even want to believe she was playing around until our youngest daughter hacked into Laura's email account and found traces of the arrangements she and her lover had left behind. Also, for the record, I was advised to cancel my credit cards after my oldest daughter discovered that my wife had blocked all the family finances in a way that left me helpless. Once again, Laura was stunned. She hadn't even realized that her precautions had been discovered, nor had she thought about how such actions would be interpreted. The fact that both of her daughters were actively working against her didn't improve her mood either. As for what my wife wants out of this process, I'm sorry I don't trust a word she says anymore. The fury in his words finally conveyed to Laura just how offended her husband was by her actions. Before she could react, the counselor turned to Dave. So what do you hope to accomplish as a result of these sessions? I hope to understand why my wife finds it acceptable to cheat on her family and go off to have fun with another man. At this point, David and Laura's marriage could still be repaired. Everything changed in an instant. And it wasn't the husband or wife's fault, but the counselor's when she muttered almost under her breath, "Oh, we have a dinosaur." Dave, who thought Laura had set the whole thing up to hasten the divorce and had deliberately chosen the counselor to minimize the chances of reconciliation, snapped out of his seat. He had heard of such counselors and thought it was just wrong. He sprinted out of the room. Laura, who had a small chance of avoiding disaster if she had run after Dave and apologized to him, took her frustration out on the counselor. By the time she finished the beating, Dave was gone. The counselor apologized and talked Laura into having an individual session with her the following week. She then apologized to David for her inappropriate behavior and had an individual session with him as well. This was the third mandatory session, at the end of which a decision was to be made as to whether to continue or drop out. Chapter 10. The family meeting the next day went no better for Laura. She just didn't understand anything. Once someone tells a lie, trust becomes a footnote in the history books, just above the tusks of a woolly mammoth. She'd invited them all over for dinner before the meeting, but Sarah reminded her that she couldn't cook worth a damn and said they'd all be there at 7:30. Laura tried to hug them all when they walked in, but they all treated her very coldly. Laura made the mistake of sitting down at the table last. By the time she was ready, she found herself alone in front of 4 stairs from the couch. She tried to persuade her best friend Sarah to move over to her, but to no avail. Frustrated once again, she began her prepared speech. It contained few apologies and a lot of "I didn't do anything" and excuses. She felt unappreciated both as a woman and as the primary breadwinner of the family. Her husband's attention became a matter of course, and she began to miss the attention that single women took for granted. She began to feel unageably attractive. When a younger man began to pay attention to her, she succumbed to his charms. During the conversation, Laura tried to focus on Daniel and Larry. She found it difficult to meet Dave's gaze, and Sarah was making notes in her notebook behind her raised knees rather irritably. Finally, the silence of those she had come to refer to as the opposition bench silenced her as well. Sarah spoke up. "Damn, Mom, you've disappointed me again." "What? Why?" "I can only give you 85% on the cliché test. If you had mentioned that it wouldn't hurt anyone if they didn't find out, I could have given you 100%. No one knew if Laura blushed out of anger or because she realized she had meant to say that too. But it slipped her mind. Whatever the reason, she realized she wasn't going to get any sympathy from her children as long as Dave controlled their hearts and minds. David, in the kitchen, now, please. Laura pounced on him as soon as they were alone behind the closed door. She hissed at him through clenched teeth. Does it really have to be like this, David? I'm going to break you until you crawl back begging me for forgiveness. Dave looked at her sadly, realizing that she was still a slave to her own nature. No, that's not necessary at all. If you just do what you think is a noble act, the outcome isn't necessarily inevitable. If you ditch the stupid bitch you chose to be your impartial counselor and we go to... I'll see you in court, David. Chapter 11. On Thursday, Dave moved into the rented three-bedroom house. The case was clearly not going to end anytime soon. He was also notified that the preliminary hearing for Danielle and Larry's custody case was scheduled for the following Tuesday. After learning the name of the family court judge assigned to him, he called John. John told him that he had gotten lucky and had picked the same judge who had never granted custody to his father. Dave declined John's offer to represent him, but asked for an appointment for the weekend to learn about the procedures and what he could and couldn't say. He was going to try to figure out the system for once and then go back to his own tactics. He was doing what he had to do to ensure the emotional well-being of his children. A fun weekend was spent setting up the rented house. Dave sat the kids down at the table and honestly told them what the short term would look like and what his long-term plans were. They perked up and joined in the planning. Together they searched the internet for everything they needed. On Tuesday, Laura's attorney was a bit shocked to learn that Dave intended to represent himself. He realized the awkward position Laura would be in when she was questioned by her own husband. Court was adjourned late that day, so only administrative matters could be discussed until the end of the session, and everyone had to appear in court the next day. Overnight, the news got to several local reporters in this leisurely news week. The next day began with Laura's attorney talking about real estate titles, relatives' incomes, and other details. Dave then began asking questions. Laura was visibly nervous, which did not go unnoticed by the reporters. He began cautiously. Did I build the family home with my own hands? Yes, you did. But I was busy working and making most of the money. You went back to work 2 months after the children were born? Yes. Who usually prepared our children's breakfasts, school lunches, and dinners? You. I worked hard. Would you say I was the primary caretaker? Probably. You recently lied to me and your children and went to Bali for 2 weeks for the express purpose of doing it with another man? Objection, Your Honor. Someone needs to tell Mr. Brown that adultery is no longer a factor in child custody disputes in this country. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't care about adultery. I just want to emphasize the character of my wife who considers herself a good mother. Objection overruled. So? I went to Bali because I needed a vacation, and it just so happened that I went with a male friend from work, yes. When you left for Bali after lying to your family, did you leave the following letter for your husband to find? Dave read the letter in its entirety. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed both reporters furiously writing something. Laura didn't have to answer the question. Her furious stare did it for her. This was embarrassing. Is it true that since returning from your dastardly trip, you have never once attempted to apologize to your husband and family for your deception and obviously immoral intentions? Again, the stern answer was silence. Your Honor, your decision seems simple. I am the primary caretaker of my minor children and always have been. They should be awarded to me along with the house I built and in which they have lived most of their lives. I have never cheated on my wife or told her and the children any blatant and damaging lies, and I demand that she recant. She has shown by her actions that she cannot influence my children. Dave sat back in his seat with his back to Laura. Her angry eyes tried to burn holes in the back of his head. The judge was fully awake by this time and immediately issued her ruling. The gist of it was that countless studies had shown that it was always better for children to live with their mother in the event of a divorce. According to her decision, temporary custody of the children and living in the family home would go to Laura. Laura smiled smugly. Dave remained neutral. This was exactly what he had expected after his conversation with John. He stood up. Your Honor, let me address the court. I would like to call attention to your own decisions in Harper v. Harper, Smith v. Smith, Fulton v. Fulton, and others too numerous to mention, where you awarded custody to the primary guardian. Receiving no response from the judge, Dave proceeded to cite 3 scientific papers refuting the claim that children are always better off with their mother. What's your point, Mr. Brown? I'm just wondering, Your Honor, can a man win in your court? The judge stared at Dave. He stared back dumbfounded. Then she declared the case closed and scheduled the next one. Reporters were writing feverishly. Dave walked over and gave them copies of Laura's letter. Then he walked out without looking back. Laura's lawyer walked over and congratulated her. She didn't feel like celebrating. Dave's speech about her not being the least bit remorseful for her actions had hit a nerve. Unfortunately, her reflex to win any fight wouldn't let her back down when the game was over. Writing off his marriage to Laura's smug smile, Dave counted everyone who had offended his sense of justice and needed to be re-educated. There turned out to be 3 of them, and plans were already in place. He had already consulted with Sarah to get a second opinion and made the changes she suggested. In fact, one of her suggestions turned out to be much better than what he had envisioned. He returned home and, through a friend in the federal government, sent a letter to the Chief Justice of the federal court outlining his accusations of bias against one of the judges. He then waited until Danielle and Larry returned from school. They readily agreed to his request to spend at least the next 2 nights with their mother. He then handed them the equipment for the second phase of his plan. 2 newspaper articles published the next day spoke unflatteringly of both Laura and the judge. Dave cut them out and emailed them to a friend of a friend of a friend. Chapter 12. Wednesday afternoon, Laura, for a change, got home on time. Daniel and Larry were there, but made it clear that it was in protest. When they deigned to answer her questions, they limited themselves to the bare minimum of words. She had to ask them to make the school lunches for the next day. It had been so long since she had done that, it had slipped her mind. Unable to find anything suitable in the cupboards, she ended up giving them money for the canteen. She got home at 4 p.m. so that she could get changed in time for 5 p.m. to go to individual counseling. At the session, she laid out her terms for Dave's return. This took half the session. The rest of the counselor's time was devoted to the history of their marriage. Laura confessed to 2 inappropriate relationships before Peter, one with a work colleague and the other with a neighbor. She emphasized that with all 3 friends, there was no actual sexual contact, failing to mention that in the first 2 cases it was not by her choice. She expressed genuine bewilderment as to why Dave was so offended by her act, since nothing had happened. The counselor promised to check with her husband about the terms, but warned that reconciliation was unlikely, given that Dave's objections seemed to be based on dishonesty and intentions rather than actions. The meeting with Dave the next day was short, abrupt, and a little intimidating. When asked what he wanted out of the session, Dave simply offered her 2 options. Either he wanted a referral to another counselor who would not openly condone female infidelity, or he wanted her to sign that the marriage was irretrievable. A little alarmed that her statement in the first session might hurt her career, the counselor quickly reported to the proper authorities that the marriage was dissolved. She knew that another report about her to a professional organization could very well be her last. When Dave returned home, Danielle and Larry were already there and looked quite settled. A police officer knocked on the door and said that he was violating a family court order. He pointed out that it wasn't him, but his children. The only way to evict them was by force, and that would be considered assault. The policeman asked the children to come with him, but they refused. So he left to get instructions. No sooner had he returned than Laura burst into the house. "David, I've already told you it doesn't have to be like this. Just tell Danielle and Larry to come with me. Give me the house, and I'll be generous with visitation and property division." "Laura, please leave my property. I will not force my children into a situation they don't want, and it will hurt their sense of right and wrong." "David, we've known each other for how long? You know me. I'm not a bad person." "That's the problem, Laura. I don't know you. The woman I married wouldn't have done what you did. She certainly wouldn't have done what you did, and then not only had no remorse, but she told our counselor to give me an ultimatum. Put up with your behavior or lose everything I hold dear. And certainly not after I found out in counseling yesterday that you had tried to have relationships with 2 other men before Peter. Tell me, Laura, what did I do to deserve what you did to me, and what are you going to do now?" The realization that the counselor had flushed her into the river made Laura blush. Guilt prevented her from taking out her anger on Dave. The bitchy counselor was another matter entirely. She was the one on whom all of Laura's anger was now focused. She has no right to tell you that. Dave didn't comment on that statement in any way, either explicitly or implicitly. Laura rushed away in a rage. Dave went and wiped the tape recorder that Daniel had put in Laura's purse before the counseling session and retrieved afterward. He was sure that righteous justice was about to visit the counselor. And he was right. 3 days later, the counselor received word that her services were no longer required. 1 down, 2 to go. Child services showed up on Saturday morning but left, disappointed when it became clear that the children would only leave if they were forcibly dragged out of the house screaming and kicking. They made the mistake of trying to apply logic to a highly emotional situation. The senior officer told Larry, "The courts have decided it's better for you to live with your mother." So the courts got it wrong. Neither Danielle nor I want to live with a liar who hurt our father. That was the end of it. Laura spent the next week trying to get all 3 children back on her side. Eventually, they refused to return her calls and immediately deleted her emails and phone messages. She tried to talk to Dave, but as soon as he realized that the conversation did not include an apology, he ended it. Finally giving up, he hired John as his divorce attorney. He also went to meet with Sarah's boss to confirm the advice she had given him. At the end of the following week, he learned from Sarah that Laura was leaving on another business trip for the entire next week. He took the week off and did a phenomenal job during the week, helping the kids after school and during office hours. What exactly that work consisted of, Laura found out when she arrived home the following Friday. She pulled into the driveway and marveled. In front of her was a beautifully landscaped lot with a suspended pool. There was a brick garage, too. All that was missing was her beautiful award-winning home. Her crumbling palace had been demolished. In its place stood a lone, very damaged building. Apparently, it had been bought at one of the insurance write-off auctions after being damaged in transit. In a daze, she opened the door and realized Dave had made an effort to replace the locks. All of her clothes, some of her furniture, and all of her personal belongings were in place. She was torn between rage and deep sadness. For a while, the sadness took over. On the floor, right in front of the door, lay a copy of the certificate of ownership. It read, "Land and dwellings at address," and the address. She realized that she had been cleverly duped. The land belonged to her, and there was indeed a dwelling on it. Now, she called her lawyer to confirm that nothing could be done about the house, and then, after thinking about it, called her financial advisor to change the only financial agreement she had entered into that could be changed at this point. It was about a trust into which a vacant piece of land had been transferred. She was told that Sarah had already exercised her right and transferred all the paperwork into her name only. Laura's last act before she finally lost her mind was to curse her own arrogance when she assumed that all 3 children would be on her side. Then she realized that the whole family had turned against her. Dave for stealing her house, the kids for not supporting her. She was very close to admitting the enormity of her crimes, but unfortunately, self-pity turned to anger again before the connection was fully made. She sent a letter to all 3 children. "Do you really hate me that much?" A lonely reply came back. "We don't hate you. You always knew I would do whatever was necessary to protect our family. It's just a shame that you put me in a position where I have to protect them from you." Signed, Dave. Laura gathered her personal belongings, then went and checked into the motel. She drove around Sarah's neighborhood to make sure the modules of her old house were neatly lined up, waiting to be installed and plugged in. On Monday at work, she received a divorce notice from Dave. He apologized for filing it here, but explained that he didn't know where else she might be. She spent the next hour trying to read between the lines of the agreement, which at first glance seemed generous. It gave her 100% ownership of the jointly acquired property, which, considering most of the other assets were locked up, was pretty good. Several expense items had to be deducted from the value of the property. These included the cost of airfare and a hotel room in Bali. A note explained that these were amounts that Dave believed Laura had stolen during the marriage. Also deducted were the costs of divorce and unraveling her financial shenanigans, including half of the expected interest on the money invested in the trust for the next 2 and 5 years respectively. She asked that the children be awarded custody to whichever parent they choose. For the sake of unity, if Danielle or Larry chose the other parent, Larry as the youngest, would make the decision. Family unity was paramount. Laura called her financial advisor and asked what the likelihood was that she would revoke the two trusts in the children's names and was told, none. He did his job well. Through her divorce attorney, she tried to get another counselor appointed. But since the first had already consented to the marriage, it was impossible to do so without Dave's consent. When she demanded such consent through her attorney, Dave reminded her that he had already suggested another counselor a few weeks earlier and had been turned down. Now that Laura seemed to be guided only by the prospect of her imminent doom, it was too late. Laura signed the contract, realizing it was the best she would ever get. Since the family court was certain to award her custody of Danielle and Larry, she would receive the assets pledged in the trusts of the two minor children as their legal guardian. That meant she would lose only the value of the second parcel of land. When all the I's and T's were dotted, the divorce went quickly. The lawyer assured her that the same family court judge would hear their cases because they were under her jurisdiction and she had a reputation for being very biased. The lawyer usually advised his male clients who confronted her to give up and save their money. Knowing that her revenge plan was on track, that she would win and Dave would be left destitute, Laura relaxed. She wondered if Dave's pride would allow her to sneak back in which case she would be magnanimous in setting conditions, or if he would resign himself to a miserable existence. Chapter 13. Having regained her confidence, Laura went to the courthouse a month later. She was met by an excited attorney. He pointed to a woman in a suit in the front row of the public gallery. "You see that woman? I went to law school with her. I hear she's now working in the office of the Chief Justice of the Federal Court. Something's going on, and I don't like it." He was clearly agitated, and it infected Laura with nervousness. The judge opened the hearing by announcing that this was her last case as she was taking early retirement. She didn't seem to be thrilled about that. Then the lawyers began. Laura objected to Dave, who demanded that all legal fees be charged to Laura. He suggested that Laura pay Dave's costs and vice versa. John disagreed, indicating that he was acting pro bono for Dave. From that point on, things went downhill. John painted an accurate picture of the couple and their relative merits as guardians. There was little Laura's attorney could do. He seemed to regret trusting the judge's protocol and not preparing much factual evidence. The proceedings lasted all morning and were clearly one-sided. Once again, the judge ruled on the case. Often glancing at the costumed woman in the audience and speaking as if she had a mouthful of broken glass, she stated that the facts of the case were simple and Dave, as the primary caregiver, should get custody. She even congratulated him on the generous offer he had made to Laura in dividing the estate and hoped he could raise the children well on the share he would accept. There was insincerity in her voice the whole time. Laura was so shocked that she missed the final clang of the judge's gavel. She returned to her lonely one-bedroom apartment and wondered which bus had hit her. She couldn't indulge in self-pity, however. She was facing a property division lawsuit. While waiting for a financial decision, she put her old house up for sale. It was a steep, uncomfortable neighborhood, suitable only for a very specific house, and the price she had agreed to set for it was very low. Unless someone replicated her old house exactly, even the landscaping would have to be abandoned. It had been spectacular before, but only because of Dave's ingenious design. This afternoon was moving time. She wanted to hand the title deeds to the new owners herself and wish them to enjoy the house as much as she did. She was disappointed when the man present announced that he was merely the agent for the new owners. They would be here soon if she wanted to wait. When Laura saw David's car followed by 4 trucks hauling away her old house and a crane behind them, she decided to leave. At the new place, she looked at the meager check she held in her hand. All she'd managed to get after the train wreck she'd turned her successful life into. Still slightly stunned, she wrote in her reflection journal that a friend had advised her to help her cope with the situation. She took a red felt tip pen and wrote in big bold letters, "Next time you get an itch, go to the damn drugstore. Next time you screw up, apologize, damn it. You're twice as smart as you think you are." About 8 weeks after she was supposed to do this, Laura went out to eat some humble pie. She bought a bottle of champagne to congratulate the new owners of the house on their arrival. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.